I arrived at the cabin earlier than anyone else because something in my chest had been tightening for days, a strange instinctive pressure, as if my bones had learned to whisper warnings before my mind could interpret them, and the winding road through the forest only made that unease grow heavier with every turn of the steering wheel. Every shadow stretching unnaturally long in the late afternoon light, every rustle of the pines that seemed to murmur secrets I was not yet supposed to hear. The cabin, usually a place of warmth and nostalgic safety, stood eerily still against the backdrop of mountains half drowned in mist, its wooden walls catching the pale gold of the sinking sun, but not reflecting any of the comfort it used to radiate when we were children running up the steps in muddy shoes, certain that inside waited hot chocolate, laughter, and the sense that our family was something unbreakable. I stepped out of the car, expecting the familiar smell of pine sap and wood smoke to soothe me. But instead, an unfamiliar chill brushed over the back of my neck, urging me toward the front door with a strange sense of urgency, the kind that mixes dread with a compulsion to know the truth no matter how brutal or unexpected it might be. I pushed the door open and the cabin greeted me with an unsettling silence, broken only by the slow tick of the old clock hanging above the stone fireplace. And for a moment, I stood frozen, sensing that the air inside held a story already in motion, one I had entered too early or perhaps exactly on time. I called out tentatively, expecting no answer and yet hoping for a familiar voice, but what I heard instead was a muffled sound, a soft, broken rhythm that carried the unmistakable tremor of someone crying, and my pulse quickened as I followed it down the hallway toward the small guest room, where the light lay dim and uneven across the floorboards. My sister was sitting on the edge of the bed, shoulders trembling, hands covering her face, as if she were trying to hold herself together with sheer will. And something inside me cracked at the sight, because she had always been the strong one, the one who could shield the world with a single steady glance, and seeing her unravel in silence filled the room with a gravity I could feel deep in my ribs. I approached her slowly, feeling the weight of every step, the growing certainty that whatever had shattered her spirit had roots deeper than anything I could have imagined. She lifted her head when she sensed me, her eyes red and swollen, but instead of speaking, she simply looked into me with a desperation that settled into my skin like cold rain, a wordless plea that sent a ripple of fear through my body. And before I could ask what had happened, before I could wrap her in my arms or gather the fragments of her composure, a faint, bright sound drifted toward us from the dining room, the unmistakable clink of elegant glass tapping against another, a sound that did not belong to sorrow or fear, but to celebration. That incongruous sound sliced through the tension like a blade, and confusion tightened inside me as I walked toward the source of it, leaving my sister momentarily behind, drawn forward by the strange duality of grief and celebration existing under the same small roof. When I entered the dining room, the warm lamp above the table cast a soft glow over the wooden surfaces, illuminating my mother standing near the window with a tall flute of champagne raised delicately in her hand, her smile serene and distant. The kind of smile that suggested she was living in a completely different emotional universe than the one my sister was drowning in down the hall. She looked elegant, composed, almost radiant, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment for reasons I could not decipher. The golden bubbles rising in her glass seemed to dance mockingly, reflecting the opposite of the tension that crawled through my veins, and I found myself struggling to reconcile the image of my mother celebrating with the choking sound of my sister's sobs behind me. The room felt off-kilter, misaligned, as if two parallel realities had collided by mistake, and I could not understand how to fit them into the same narrative without something in the center giving way. My mother's eyes shimmered with an emotion I could not name, too calm to be joy, too steady to be shock, and beneath her composure I sensed an undercurrent of something deliberate, some decision she had made long before any of us arrived at the cabin. The air felt dense around her, charged with a meaning that lingered just beyond comprehension, and curiosity battled with apprehension inside me as I opened my mouth to speak before stopping myself, struck by the eerie awareness that this moment demanded silence first, observation before action, because whatever truth hung between the walls of this cabin was delicate and dangerous, like a thread drawn too tight. The tension wrapped around my chest again as I turned back toward the hallway, hearing my sister's quiet sob echo faintly, grounding me in the reality that something deeply wrong was unfolding, a story fractured into opposing emotional extremes, and I felt suspended between them, unsure which side held the truth or how to navigate the conflicting signals that filled the cabin with unsettling static. I wanted to run to my sister, to demand answers from my mother, to tug the truth out of the shadows with my bare hands if I had to. But something told me this was only the beginning, that the silence, the tears, and the champagne toast were not isolated events but interconnected pieces of a larger, more complex tapestry waiting to unfold. I could feel the forest outside pressing in against the windows, the wind brushing the cabin walls with a low, haunting hum, as if the world itself knew a revelation was approaching and was holding its breath in anticipation. And in the midst of that strange, emotional tension, I turn toward you now, whoever you are listening to this unraveling story, and I ask you to stay with me in this moment of confusion and rising dread, because stories like this become less heavy when shared, and sometimes naming our fears aloud gives us the strength to face what lies ahead. If you've ever walked into a place expecting safety and instead found a fracture running through the heart of everything you thought you understood, you know the weight pressing on my chest right now, and I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments, because maybe together we can unravel the meaning behind these conflicting emotions before they swallow the room whole. But before we continue deeper into this labyrinth of secrets and uncanny emotional contrasts, before I walk back down the hallway to gather the courage to sit beside my sister or confront the strange celebration in my mother's eyes, the air in the cabin had thickened by the time I gathered the courage to return to my sister's side, as though every heartbeat was another echo bouncing between wooden walls soaked in unspoken truths. She hadn't moved from the bed, but the room felt heavier, the energy colder, and her posture seemed to have shrunk in on itself, like a soul trying to disappear. I sat beside her in silence, the floorboards creaking faintly under our combined weight, the distant clinking of my mother's glass still resonating in my head like a refrain from a song that didn't belong in this scene. My mind twisted with questions that felt dangerous to ask, as if speaking them might rupture whatever fragile balance still held our family together. I looked around the small room, the faded wallpaper, the suitcase half unzipped on the floor, a crumpled piece of paper that had fallen near her feet. It looked almost accidental, but there was something about the way she avoided my gaze, the way her hands trembled when I reached for it, that made me certain it was anything but. I picked up the paper slowly, feeling the edge tremble in my grip, and unfolded it under the dim light spilling from the bedside lamp. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's, each letter flowing elegantly, meticulously controlled, a style that had always seemed to mirror her nature, graceful on the surface, yet calculating in the space between strokes. The words, though, were another story entirely. They were a farewell, not to life, but to something even deeper, a kind of emotional severance. She had written about release, about letting go of burdens no one else could see, about a truth she had carried alone for too long. My pulse pounded in my ears as I read phrases that twisted themselves around the shadows of memory, references to guilt, to secrets she had sworn to protect, to a decision that would finally bring her peace. My sister's sobs grew softer behind me. No longer just grief, but exhaustion. The sound of someone who had spent every ounce of energy trying to make sense of a betrayal that couldn't be explained by logic alone. I turned toward her and finally understood that she had arrived before me, found the note, and read the confession first. Whatever she had seen in those lines had cracked something fundamental inside her. The champagne, the smile, the eerie calm on our mother's face, they weren't signs of joy. They were symptoms of release, of a mind that had already stepped across a threshold we hadn't yet reached. I could feel the realization seeping into me like ice, spreading slowly from the edges inward. The cabin no longer felt like home, but a stage for revelation, each room holding a different act of a truth we were only beginning to piece together. Somewhere between the ink and the trembling paper, I sensed a story older than the moment itself. The weight of years unspoken, choices made in silence, love twisted by protection and guilt. The clock ticked in the distance, each second sharper than the last, and I felt as if the walls themselves were narrowing, pushing us toward an inevitable confrontation. I stood, still holding the letter, and walked down the hallway again, the wooden floor creaking with a sound that carried like footsteps in a cathedral, sacred and accusatory. My mother hadn't moved from where I'd last seen her. She was now sitting at the head of the table, the champagne glass half empty beside her, the bottle glinting in the lamplight. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the cabin, and I couldn't tell if she was waiting for us or for something else entirely. There was a serenity in her stillness that frightened me more than any outburst could have. It was the stillness of someone who had already made peace with an outcome that the rest of us were still resisting. I wanted to speak, to shatter the distance with questions that had no safe answers. Why the note? Why the calm? Why the contrast between your serenity and her despair? But something in her expression stopped me. It wasn't denial, nor was it indifference. It was sorrow, deep and ancient, wrapped in a kind of acceptance that only those who have lived through unbearable truths could carry without crumbling. She looked up at me finally, her eyes glistening not with tears but with a sheen of quiet resolve, and I felt time stretch thin between us, the moment teetering on the edge of confession. And yet she said nothing. She didn't need to, because in the silence, everything became clear. The champagne wasn't a toast to joy, but a ritual of closure, a symbolic gesture marking the end of something long concealed. I realized that she had been living with a secret for years, one that had bound her tightly in guilt and silence, and now she was freeing herself from it in the only way she knew how, by acknowledging it, celebrating its release, even if it meant shattering us in the process. The note was her confession, and the tears in my sister's eyes were the result of knowing what that confession contained. The truth about the father we had buried years ago, about the accident that wasn't truly an accident, about choices made in desperation that rippled forward through time like cracks in glass. The forest outside groaned under the weight of wind, and the lights flickered once, twice, as if the world itself hesitated in the face of what had been unearthed. My sister appeared in the doorway behind me, her face pale and haunted but steadier now, as if the first shock had burned itself away and left behind a new kind of strength, fragile but present. Our mother's calm expression faltered for the first time when she saw her, and something tender, almost apologetic, passed between them, an invisible current of emotion that needed no words. I stood between them, the letter trembling in my hand, realizing I was not just witnessing the collapse of old secrets, but the rebirth of truth itself. And though it hurt, there was a strange beauty in the honesty unfolding before me. The night deepened, shadows growing longer, the forest outside whispering like an audience to our family's reckoning. I poured out the remaining champagne, the fizz dying quietly in the glass, and for the first time in hours the cabin felt almost still, almost grounded. My mother exhaled, my sister's breathing evened, and I felt an invisible line being redrawn between us, the fragile beginning of healing, born from devastation. Yet something in me knew this wasn't over. There were layers still hidden beneath the surface, parts of the story that the letter didn't fully reveal, truths we'd have to confront before dawn broke. Because the real question wasn't just what she had done, but why she had chosen now, this cabin, this night, this reunion, to let the truth breathe. Maybe the forest held the answer. Maybe the air itself had been waiting for release. Maybe grief needs ritual just as joy does. And this was hers. The thought terrified me and soothed me at the same time. I stood there between them, the paper now crumpled in my hand, feeling the weight of history pressing on my lungs, and I realized that every family eventually reaches a night like this. A night when the truth, long buried, demands to be seen, no matter the cost. And that's where we were, suspended between heartbreak and redemption, silence and confession, despair and fragile hope. The cabin's silence no longer felt empty but sacred, as though it were absorbing every emotion we released, storing it somewhere deep within its timbered bones. I looked from my mother's steady eyes to my sister's trembling hands, and something inside me settled with quiet resolve. Whatever had happened in the past, whatever dark choices had shaped this night, it was time to face them. Not as victims, but as survivors ready to rebuild meaning from the wreckage. I drew in a long breath, felt the scent of pine and earth fill my chest, and I knew the next act would demand courage, compassion, and a willingness to understand the kind of love that hides behind unbearable pain. And before I lead you there, before the moment when the full truth finally comes to light and every wound finds its place in the long story of forgiveness, if you've been walking beside me through this strange, emotional labyrinth, through the silence of the cabin and the contradictions of champagne and tears, I want to thank you for staying. Stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be felt. So before we step into the heart of what happened that night, take a moment to breathe, to steady your own heart, and if this story has reached some quiet corner of your soul, consider subscribing, because this space is for those who understand that truth, no matter how painful, is always worth facing. Now come with me. The night isn't over yet. The forest had grown darker, the last threads of twilight gone, leaving only the rhythmic pulse of crickets and the whisper of wind against the windows. Inside, the air shimmered faintly with the tension of what had been confessed without words. My mother's hands were trembling now, the mask of composure cracking as though the weight of decades had finally become too much to hold. My sister moved closer, not with anger this time, but with something softer. The hesitant compassion that comes after exhaustion, after every tear has already been spent. I felt the weight of the letter still in my palm, creased and warm from my grasp, and something inside me whispered that it was time to read it aloud, to let the truth become a sound instead of a secret. My voice shook as I unfolded the paper, and the first line cut through the silence like a blade dipped in memory. Forgive me for the silence I chose over the truth. The words drifted into the room and seemed to alter the air itself, pulling my mother's gaze from the table to the ceiling, as though she were watching the ghosts of her own choices floating above us. Each line revealed another fragment of the hidden life we'd been living unknowingly. The way our father's accident had not been pure fate. The way love and fear had collided on a night years ago when one desperate decision changed everything. She had been the one driving, not him. The road had been wet, the fight between them bitter, and the headlights of another car had appeared too fast around the curve. He hadn't survived, but she had. And she had sworn that the story would die with him, that we would never know the truth, that she would carry the guilt alone as penance. My sister covered her mouth with both hands, the sound that escaped her somewhere between disbelief and release. I felt my heart crack open, not just from pain but from recognition, because beneath the horror of it, I saw something achingly human. A mother's love twisted by fear, a choice that grew monstrous under the weight of silence. My mother began to speak then, her voice so faint it was almost a whisper, trembling as though she were confessing not to us, but to the universe itself. She spoke of years haunted by the memory of headlights, of how she'd kept the cabin as a shrine to the family we once were, returning every year to replay that night in her mind, searching for forgiveness she never believed she deserved. And then, finally, she said the words that unraveled everything. I thought if I let go tonight, if I toasted him, I could finally make peace. The champagne, the toast. It wasn't celebration. It was a farewell, a fragile ritual meant to release her guilt into the world. My sister sank to her knees, her tears silent now, and I knelt beside her, feeling the old walls breathe around us. My mother's eyes softened, the years of shame washing away from her face like dust after a storm. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden forgiveness shouted into the air, only the slow, sacred quiet of three people choosing to stay in the same room even after the truth had burned through it. Sometimes that's the bravest thing a family can do: remain. We sat like that for what felt like hours, the night wrapping us in its heavy, forgiving arms. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and I could almost hear our father's laughter echoing faintly through memory, not as accusation, but as reminder that love doesn't vanish when truth arrives. It changes shape, becomes something deeper, sharper, realer. My mother reached for the bottle of champagne again, her fingers trembling, and for a second I thought she might fall back into her ritual. But instead, she poured 3 glasses, her eyes meeting mine with a look that asked silently for permission to begin again. I nodded. We lifted our glasses, not in denial of the pain, but in honor of survival. The bubbles caught the firelight, and for the first time they didn't seem mocking but tender, tiny sparks of forgiveness rising and bursting softly in the air. The toast was simple, wordless, but it carried more weight than any apology ever could. In that moment, the cabin no longer felt haunted. It felt human again, imperfect, scarred, alive. The forest outside seemed to lean closer, the wind brushing against the windows like an exhale, as if even nature had been waiting for this release. When dawn began to seep through the trees, pale and forgiving, we were still awake, sitting together at the table that had witnessed everything. My sister's head rested against my shoulder, my mother's eyes half closed, her breathing deep and steady for the first time in years. The letter lay in the center of the table, its ink smudged, its confessions spent. I looked at it and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not relief, but the quiet beginning of peace. The kind that doesn't come all at once but grows slowly, like sunlight through fog. And as I looked around that cabin, once a tomb of secrets, now a fragile cradle of truth, I realized that maybe this is what healing really looks like. Not erasing the pain, but learning to live beside it without fear. Not pretending the past was beautiful, but finding beauty in the fact that we survived it. We stood together, the 3 of us, as the first morning light spilled across the wooden floor, and for a fleeting second, I felt the presence of our Father there with us. Not in anger or sorrow, but in love, vast and forgiving, like the dawn itself. The morning unfolded slowly, as though the world itself were relearning how to breathe after holding its lungs full of grief for too long. The forest no longer pressed against the cabin with menace, but exhaled softly, releasing what it had held in silence through the long night. Mist curled through the trees like smoke rising from a forgotten altar, and the pale light of dawn spread across the earth with a fragile tenderness that seemed to understand everything we had endured. For hours I had sat by the window, unable to sleep, watching as the darkness dissolved into a gray-blue calm that promised, in its own quiet way, that no night lasts forever. My sister was curled beneath a wool blanket on the couch, her hair tangled and her face peaceful for the first time in years, and my mother sat beside the dying fire, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes half closed as if she were still listening to the echoes of what had been confessed. There was something sacred in the silence that followed revelation, not the heavy, suffocating silence that had haunted the cabin before, but one that breathed, that pulsed with the quiet rhythm of relief. The walls that had once held our secrets now seemed lighter, as though they had absorbed our pain and released it into the air. I could smell pine and damp earth through the cracked window, and every small sound, the crackle of the embers, the creak of old wood settling, carried a softness that felt like forgiveness. I thought about the note still resting on the table, the champagne glasses drying in the sink, and how easily life could shift between despair and grace. My mother had fallen asleep sitting upright, her head tilted slightly, the faintest smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. For the first time, she looked unburdened. It struck me then how strange and beautiful forgiveness was. Not an act, not a decision, but a gradual letting go. A surrender that begins somewhere deep in the soul before the mind can catch up. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, its light fell directly onto her hands, illuminating them with a gentle warmth. Those hands had carried everything. Guilt, love, shame, care, all tangled together across decades of sacrifice. I watched her breathe, slow and steady, and I realized that the story of our family had never been one of perfection or tragedy, but of endurance. Every choice, every mistake, every silence had led us here, to this fragile peace on the other side of the storm. My chest tightened with gratitude and grief all at once, a paradox I didn't want to solve. I stepped quietly outside, letting the door close behind me with a soft click, and the morning air wrapped around me like a promise. The forest was awake. Dew shimmered on the grass, tiny pearls of light scattered across the earth. Somewhere nearby, a stream whispered, its steady rhythm a reminder that time, no matter how wounded, keeps moving forward. I walked down the narrow path leading toward it, my boots brushing against damp leaves, the air cool and sweet in my lungs. Each step felt like a baptism, a washing away of what had been too heavy to carry. The cabin, behind me now, stood like a sentinel among the trees, not haunted anymore, but hallowed. I could almost feel my father's presence in the morning light, not as a ghost or accusation, but as something vast and forgiving, woven into the rustle of leaves and the slow heartbeat of the earth. When I reached the edge of the stream, I crouched down and let my fingers slip into the cold water. It stung at first, sharp and electric, then numbed and finally soothed. The current carried fragments of leaves and slivers of sunlight downstream, an endless procession of motion and renewal. I thought about everything my mother had confessed, about the unbearable weight of truth she had carried alone, and how easily love can twist itself into pain when it's forced to hide in silence. She had kept the truth not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear that we wouldn't love her anymore if we knew. Fear that the family she'd fought to hold together would crumble. But love, real love, doesn't break under truth. It expands. It aches. It trembles. It shatters the illusions we hide behind. But it always finds its way back to itself. I stood and looked back toward the cabin, its outline blurred by the soft veil of mist. From here it looked small, almost fragile, but it contained an entire history. Laughter, arguments, secrets, the echoes of countless meals shared in that same dining room. I knew then that I would never sell it, never let it fall into strangers' hands. It was more than a structure. It was a vessel of memory, a testament to the way pain and love can coexist without destroying each other. One day, maybe, I'd return here with my own children, not to tell them the details of what happened, but to teach them the lesson it gave us. That truth is not the end of love, but the beginning of it. When I went back inside, the fire had gone cold, but the room was filled with the golden glow of morning. My mother was awake now, her eyes bright, her movements slow but steady. My sister was stirring beneath the blanket, stretching, yawning softly. For a moment, I just stood in the doorway watching them. Two people bound to me by blood and history, both broken and mended by the same night. My mother met my gaze, and without a word we understood each other. There was no need for apology anymore. The past could not be undone, but it could be accepted. Acceptance was not surrender. It was survival. We spent the morning cleaning, a quiet ritual of restoration. My sister gathered the empty glasses and washed them in the sink, the sound of water gentle and rhythmic. My mother folded the blanket, straightened the chairs, opened the windows to let in fresh air. I swept the floor, each motion grounding me further into the present. The scent of coffee began to drift through the air, rich and comforting. It was astonishing how normal everything felt, how peace didn't come in thunderclaps or tears, but in these small, steady acts of living. We didn't speak much, and we didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It was full of understanding. By noon, sunlight spilled freely through every window, and the cabin felt alive again. Birds perched on the sill, unafraid. My sister put on a record from the old box in the corner, a soft, crackling tune that must have belonged to our parents' youth. The melody filled the room like a memory finding its way home. My mother closed her eyes, swaying slightly, her expression serene. I watched her, realizing that she was finally free. The weight she had carried had dissolved, not because we had erased the past, but because she had trusted us enough to share it. In that act, she had transformed guilt into connection. We ate lunch together, nothing special, just bread, fruit, and coffee, but every bite felt sacred. My sister laughed at something trivial, and the sound startled me at first, then filled me with warmth. I hadn't realized how long it had been since laughter felt natural in this family. My mother joined in, her laughter quieter but just as real. It rippled through the air like music, and I found myself smiling until my cheeks hurt. It was as though we were rediscovering each other, not as the versions we had been, but as the people we were becoming. Later, when it was time to leave, we stood together on the porch, looking out over the forest. The sky had deepened into a clear blue, the kind that carries no trace of storm. My mother turned the key in the lock and pressed it into my hand, her fingers warm against mine. She didn't say anything, but her eyes did. A silent request, a passing of guardianship, a quiet trust that the cabin and its memories would be safe. I nodded, understanding. Some legacies are too personal to be written in wills or letters. They must be carried in the heart. As we drove down the narrow forest road, the cabin disappeared behind the trees, its roof glinting one last time in the sunlight before it was swallowed by distance. My sister leaned her head against the window, her reflection soft and thoughtful. My mother rested her hand on my shoulder from the back seat, a gesture so simple yet so full of meaning that I felt tears rise in my eyes. The road stretched ahead, winding through light and shadow, and I realized that we weren't escaping the past. We were carrying it forward, reshaped by truth, softened by forgiveness. Hours later, as the city came into view, the noise and movement of life felt almost foreign. The world had kept turning, oblivious to the transformation that had taken place deep in the forest. Yet I carried that silence with me, the kind that only comes after everything has been said, when love and pain have merged into something enduring. I knew that there would still be difficult days, that healing doesn't erase what hurt us. But I also knew that every sunrise would feel a little different now, brighter somehow, because it carried the proof that no darkness lasts forever. That night, lying in my own bed for the first time in days, I thought of the cabin again. I imagined the light filtering through the trees, the way the river would still be whispering, the way the air there seemed to hold stories like breath. I thought of my father, his laughter, his presence, the love he had left behind, and I hoped he had found peace in knowing that we finally had too. Maybe he had never wanted us to carry the burden of that night. Maybe he had been waiting all along for us to find our way back to each other. I closed my eyes and felt an overwhelming calm settle inside me, deep and steady. For the first time in years, there was no tightness in my chest, no restless guilt scratching at the edges of my thoughts. Just stillness, just gratitude. The kind that humbles you, that reminds you how fragile and miraculous it is simply to be alive, to love, to forgive. And as sleep began to pull me under, I understood something I hadn't before. That healing isn't a destination, it's a rhythm. Some days it moves slowly, almost imperceptibly, like mist lifting from the trees. Other days it rushes forward, washing through you like rain. But it never stops. If you've stayed with me through this journey, through the darkness of the cabin, through the tears, through the dawn, know that stories like this, aren't just mine. They belong to anyone who has ever learned that the truth, no matter how painful, can be the first step toward freedom. If this story found you in a quiet place, if it reminded you that even the deepest wounds can bloom into light, then carry that with you. Like the forest after the storm, we all have the power to begin again. And as the final light of day faded through my window, I whispered a silent promise to the night that I would keep choosing peace, keep choosing love, keep honoring the truth that set us free. Because in the end, that is what endures. Not the pain, not the secrets, not even the cabin itself, but the quiet, unbreakable thread of love that ties us back together, no matter how many times we fall apart. If this story touched you, let it remind you to hold close the ones you love, to speak when silence grows too heavy, to forgive even when it feels impossible. Because every heart deserves its dawn, and when yours comes, as it surely will, may you greet it with open hands and a steady breath, ready at last to live in the light again.